Good afternoon, everybody. And my name is Siobhan Brown. I'm the MSP for Eyre, Prestwick and Troon. And a very warm welcome to you, everybody joining us today for the Towns and Town Centre CPG. We're also joined today by other MSPs, Neil Bibby, Fiona Hislop MSP, Gillian Martin, and Paul Swinney MSP. For those who have not attended one of the meetings before, the purpose of this CPG is to develop ideas and innovations to help Scotland's towns get through the great challenges that they are currently facing. We all know that our town centres are not going to be the bustling retail hubs that they were 25 to 30 years ago. We have all our supermarkets out with town centres, we have industrial estates, and of course, for the last decade or so, we've also had online shopping, and that was all before COVID. So after COVID, we're dealing with the aftermath of the pandemic together with the global climate crisis. So the aim of this group is to look at initiatives to transform our towns during these difficult days so that our towns can emerge stronger, smarter, healthier, greener in different ways previously, but more importantly, continue to be the beating heart of the community, which has been so important historically. We've got a lot to get through today, so I won't take up any more of your time, but I'm really looking forward to hearing all the contributions and the discussions. I'll move on to agenda item number 2, which is the minutes of the last meeting. And if anybody who is present was at the last meeting, if they could please, if I could have a proposer and a seconder by putting up your hand or in the chat function, please.
One from Phil Prentice.
Thank you, Phil. And a seconder for the minutes. Have we got a seconder? I can't see the screen.
I can't see one yet. Either the raised hand function or come off mute and second, please.
Tom Smithman.
Thank you, Tom.
Brilliant, thank you very much. We'll move on to agenda item number 3, which is an overview on town centres beyond retail by Phil Prentice, who's the Chief Officer of Scotland's Town Partnership. Welcome, Phil.
Thanks, convener, and welcome everybody to the latest of our CPGs on town centres. Today we're going to look at town centres beyond retail. Whenever we first published our Town Centre Action Plan back in 2014, it was quite clear even then that whilst retail would still have a fundamental role in town centres, it wasn't going to be a retail-led recovery. The predominance of retail was going to continue to diminish, and we needed to think of a more mixed-use approach. So during COVID and with climate emergency in mind, a review group was set up, led by Professor Lee Sparks, reporting directly to the Minister, to refresh the Town Centre Action Plan. And that was just launched last month in Kirkcaldy, a ministerial launch of a Town Centre Action Plan 2. And that is very much to give people a sense of direction in terms of what is beyond retail in our town centres, that mixed use approach, more residential, more leisure, different types of uses, thinking about the climate, bringing in green infrastructure, etc. So there is we do have a plan in place, and we're just on the cusp of starting to implement that. The key things within that plan are looking at firmer policy alignment, making sure towns are much more prioritised in terms of the planning system, making sure that the touch points between the economic strategies, climate strategies, transport, digital, culture, heritage, all of these align much more. Also the fiscal rebalancing. Let's have a look at NDR, let's have a look at the VAT and tax regimes, and ultimately the digital sales tax, etc. And in resources, start rewarding good behaviour, start to punish the bad behaviours, looking at long-term sustained financing, and the Scottish Government have already contributed in terms of the place-based investment fund, £325 million over the lifetime of the Parliament. In addition to that, a further 50 to look at dereliction and vacancy. There's also the UK government funding in terms of levelling up. So for the first time in living memory, we've got substantial resources to grasp this opportunity and to start to think about nurturing our town centres, building out our town centres from the core again, investing in them much more aggressively. So we've got a great session planned today with a number of expert speakers. That's just an overview to say plans in place, resources are available. We do have some really good ideas in the new future for Scotland's towns. So without further ado, I'll hand back to convener who can introduce you to the next speakers. Thanks.
Thank you, Phil. And we'll move on to the next item, which is agenda item number 4, which is Town Centre Living and Housing. And we have Mari Donahue from the Associate Director of Scottish Futures Trust.
Hello, everyone. I'm hoping that you can all hear me. Yep, I'll
Yes.
move on then. Good. So I work within the Place, Housing and Economic Investment team within Scottish Futures Trust. And I would say across these 3 aspects, the town centre living merges, the issues of town centre living merge. So we have been tasked by Scottish Government with working with Scottish Government to look at the issues and the opportunities around town centre living. And if I can give you a wee bit of context for this around why we're interested, the collective why we're interested in town centre living, I think I would say first and foremost, there's strong policy support in this area. So we know that the Town Centre Action Plan 2, we know that there are actions to increase town centre living across all 4 themes. We've got to have the right policy framework in place, the right kind of support in place, to have a good investment framework and to have partnership working. We also know that town centre living was in the previous version of the Town Centre Action Plan. It's probably had less traction than some of the other elements within the Town Centre Action Plan, and we know that there's a need to focus more work on it. From the policy perspective, we also know that it's a priority within the city's plan. And we know that it's in Housing to 2040. There's a strong policy support in terms of increasing town centre living to help build stronger, more resilient, more vibrant places, but also to reduce empty homes and also empty properties. So we've been tasked by Scottish Government with looking at a series of issues around town centre living to identify how we can get more activity moving forward. We know that town centre living is more expensive to deliver. We know that it's more time consuming to deliver. It takes longer to deliver these projects. We know that it's more risky to deliver. And in an era where we're driven largely by targets, we are making it increasingly difficult for ourselves to achieve town centre living. We do know that we need opportunities around catalytic investment. And we know if we think about town centre living, it's not an affordable housing. I think our sphere just now is moving beyond that affordable housing perspective and moving into more an era of affordable living, where having access to central services is a key feature. I think one of the key things when we started out looking at this, one of the things that we started talking about is, what are the things that we're doing just now? What's the things that are happening just now, or the things that are not happening just now, that in 10 years' time we'll look back on and see it as a missed opportunity? So from that point of view, how can we attract additional town centre living to happen in our communities, which we all know is a good idea, strong policy focus for it, the town centre first, the place principle, all of these things are all heading towards town centre living, and yet we are not effectively delivering against those policy messages for a whole bunch of different reasons. In terms of the Short Life Working Group, we were asked by Scottish Government to pull together this Short Life Working Group. We have brought together Scottish Government, both from the housing and the regeneration teams. We've got a Scottish Land Commission and Architecture and Design Scotland. We've got the Improvement Service, and we have Phil at Scotland's Towns Partnerships. We are looking to investigate a whole series of core questions. As you can see down the side here, how can we increase town centre living across Scotland? What are the blockages and the barriers to getting more town centre living? What sort of places are attractive to town centre living? And what lessons can we take from elsewhere? In terms of working with people, no, sorry, I'm going to move on. Sorry, I'm rambling here. In terms of the things, I guess we started at the start of this process, started thinking about what are the things that we already know. So Alison, if you can move the slide on, please. What are the things that we already think that we know? So I guess we started from this from the point of view of confirmation bias. we don't want to just blindly take forward those things that we already believe. We think these things are the right things that are happening just now in the drivers and the barriers, but we need to consider to make sure that they are right before we move them forward. So in terms of positive drivers, we think that town centre living is beneficial for people, it's beneficial for places, it's beneficial for businesses, it's also beneficial for the climate. We also think from a positive point of view, there's unmet demand, and you'll hear later on from Retty and the work that they've been doing around demand for town centre living. We also believe that there are a whole series of negative drivers that are constraining town centre living coming forward. We think the private sector is not interested, or I should say is less interested in town centre living. As I said earlier, it's too difficult, it's too expensive, it's too risky, it's too lengthy, it's too bureaucratic to deliver. We think that the financial returns from residential development are better elsewhere. So why would the public sector, why would the private sector deliver to focus on town centre living? And we also believe that housing targets are driving volume development when we're set with housing targets, making it harder to address some of these wider policy aims that we have. In terms of other drivers, the community and social benefits are difficult to account for in project appraisal. There's no easy way to include some of these wider non-quantifiable benefits within a standard value for money appraisal. So some balancing up the equation and the scales between the financial costs, the additional cost of delivering town centre living against those wider benefits. We don't think that it's an equal scale in terms of the weighting of what's being achieved by town centre living. And we also know that the attribution from the activity to the long-term outcome and the benefits of it, there is no evidence base. We know that there's a theoretical link between increasing the number of people living in a town centre, generating positive outcomes, but there's no real evidence base that would support that as a project appraisal. So within this short life working group, and Alison, could you move to the next slide, please? We have been looking, we've adopted a case study based approach to gather some of this evidence based on real project experience. We found maybe about 40 or 50 different projects, and the number keeps growing on almost on a daily basis. 40 or 50 projects that we've been looking at based on real project experience. And you can see on the map here, the added some red dots around examples of where we've found. We've got projects from Irvine to Inverness, from Langholm to Lerwick, and everywhere in between. I would say that we are short on examples of town centre living, good town centre living projects that have been successfully delivered, both within the north and west of Scotland and also from an island context. So I'm going to ask at the end if anybody has any examples that they could bring forward to us. We are going through a kind of an iterative process and looking at some of these examples and some of these projects. We have kind of a high level review of about 40 or 50. We've done project reviews maybe around about 20 times, and we're doing detailed analysis, including consultations with around 4 or 6 towns, and that's the place that we're at just now on this. In terms of the initial learning we've gotten from the analysis that we have, Alison, yeah, good, thanks. The initial learning, and I would stress that this is initial, but this seems to be what's coming out from the conversations and the analysis that we're doing just now. There are issues, and as Phil said earlier, the fiscal environment, it's not a level playing field. So there are issues around VAT for building restoration versus VAT on new build development. We are getting feedback that funding programmes have a strong focus on the heritage asset restoration element rather than on new build development. We think there are issues around property values and whether it's hope values, hope aspiration values that are constraining future development. We believe there are issues around market capacity, around constrained industry base from the contractor and developer sector, but also in terms of the workforce shortages, which are making it difficult. From an organisational point, projects are often driven by someone with a special interest, and that special interest can often be about firefighting specific issues and typically a building and a heritage asset building issues. We have some queries around the policy focus, and I'm going to stress that this is very much high level at this stage and is not a final position from the group. Some issues around affordable and mid-market supply, and the focus on that is perhaps constraining interest at a market level. We found lots and lots of different activities and different really successful and really innovative project ideas coming forward, but they are largely within the RSL, to a lesser extent within the mid-market sector, but largely at the RSL sector. We found a couple of examples where there's been commercial development that have moved forward with a private developer, and the level of interest and demand in these has been astronomical. The developer has been blown away by the amount of demand that there is, but these sorts of projects are few and far between. We also have a query around whether the policy focus over recent years has been around stimulating demand for people to purchase and to rent in town centres, rather than around stimulating the supply of new delivery in town centres. The second last slide from me is around some of the initial findings from the group. So as I've said, heritage asset renewal is a major driver, and that is largely being driven by the funding that's available through initiatives like CARS and THI type projects. There isn't really any funding for your standard residential development beyond the affordable housing supply programme grants, which often are insufficient to address the gap funding issues that we have when we're looking at some of the activities around living over the shops and the additional burdens and the costs that places. Sorry, RSL, I just see a sector there, registered social landlord, so the social landlord sector. Apologies for that. We're seeing a number of examples coming around townwide, around housing for older people, where again the RSL sector has been active. So there are places like Alexandria, the Falkirk project. I'm in a North Lanarkshire session this morning, and they were talking about some projects that they have and that they've been delivering the RSLs around housing for older people. That's been a big driver as well in terms of development. We think there are opportunities to expand that with using some of the successes that we have, that we've found, use that as a driver to encourage more development elsewhere. Lots of different bespoke approaches being used by lots of different places, and to an extent people are developing project proposals almost blindly without a full awareness of what's been successful elsewhere. When we're talking to people, there's really strong interest in learning about what other places are doing. So some of the examples that we've found where Aberdeenshire Council and Fraserburgh have adopted, if you like, a missing shares approach, where they're able to fill in some of the gaps in funding that private owners in a tenement tile living above the shops type schemes, where the private owner is unwilling or unable to fund their element of the project. The public sector have come in and filled that gap and put a title burden on, and that has been very successful in delivering. We also know that a number of councils, Falkirk, North Ayrshire, have feasibility funds that they're working with private owners to deliver additional, to do the feasibility research that gives the confidence to the private sector and also to RSL, the public sector and registered social landlords to deliver additional housing. What we think in terms of gaps, as I said, we think there are gaps around living over the shops. We think there are gaps around major site and major asset redevelopment for mixed use development. And we think there is limited private sector commercial-led development out with the city centres. So these are the kind of, I guess the final question I've got on for you here is, in terms of gaps in knowledge, we're still at the point of looking at why do projects happen, what are the key drivers and what are the key constraints? And also understanding around why, how and why individual project place strategies support and drive activity. So I guess I've got two questions that I realise there won't be time to cover necessarily today, but I would appreciate if anyone could come back to me. I guess is, do you recognise some of the initial learnings and the findings that we have been, we've identified through our work? And we're at the midpoint of our work, so there's plenty of time to add additional thoughts into this process. But also, are you aware of other town centre living projects that we can encompass and we can include within our work to embed the learning and the knowledge that we have? I guess I'm going to close with a final comment around this point, as I made earlier on, about the evidence base. We don't have a strong enough evidence base for town centre living. We think there's demand out there. We think it's a good thing to do, but we don't have anything that will help us to prove the benefits of town centre living across economic, across social, across environmental, across carbon well-being, and across community factors. And that's where we are just now, is trying to rebalance that equation in terms of the cost benefit of doing this sort of project activity. So I would welcome all thoughts and all feedback that people have from this. So thanks very much.
Brilliant. Thanks very much, Murray. That was really fascinating and interesting. I know that you've given your email address there, and hopefully if we can't answer all your questions, we'll get to everyone's comments today. Alison, could we email maybe everyone attending today Murray's email address and the questions, just in case everybody wants to respond? We have also been joined by Marie McNair, MSP, Evelyn Tweed, MSP, and Gillian Martin has arrived as well. So welcome. And if we can move on to agenda item number 4. Agenda item number 5, which is analysis of town centre living, new data and report by Andrew Meehan, who's an Associate Director of Retty & Co. Welcome, Andrew.
Can everyone hear me? Perfect. I'll just share my screen and hopefully everyone can see that. It doesn't seem to be on presenter mode, but
It's absolutely fine, Andrew.
okay.
Fine.
Great. We were approached by the SFT to look at the sort of town living strategy, particularly looking at housing demand and the assessment for that sort of living. We approached it on a case study basis. And this presentation is a sort of work in progress and our sort of emerging findings. So there's quite a lot of analysis that lies behind this presentation. And we're just trying to highlight some of the sort of key points that might be interested at this stage. If anyone wants to get into the weeds with it, I'll be happy to take questions and talk at another time. So just looking at how we're sort of the brief was constructed. We're looking to, apologies. So essentially, in the way the first step we had was to look at all the towns across Scotland and narrow down the choice of which case studies we're then going to look at in more detail. And basically, to do this, we used a range of data sources, comparing towns across a range of measures. You'll see some of the sort of broad buckets that we put on the left-hand side. We then conducted a sort of more detailed cluster analysis to sort of group towns by certain attributes. A few of the examples of how this was approached can be seen here. For example, we're looking at sort of older household, sort of family households versus single person households, and again just grouping certain towns that sort of grouped together. For example, family housing, the likes of Miltimber, Gartcosh, Lucas, all further to the right. Single person housing in sort of more urban centres such as Paisley. Looked at other measures such as tenure. Again, some outliers there such as St Andrews with its student population, very high levels of PRS tenure, compared with high levels of owner occupation in places like Dunblane or Bearsden. And just as another example, life stage, older households, retirement style living in places like Ely, Tinebrook, younger households in places like Livingston. So from this, we essentially created sort of 7 typologies of sort of towns that can overlap, but where you basically had similar attributes across a range of measures. So for example, a family commuter location such as Bearsden might also be a prime residential destination, or a mature lifestyle destination could also act as a rural centre, so somewhere like Kelso. But this initial step allowed us to sort of narrow down the towns we were potentially going to look at, or the town centres we were going to look at. From this, we created a list of 8 where we were going to focus more specifically in line with the SFT. So these became Kilwinning, Forres, Stonehaven, Galashiels, Fort William, Airdrie and Lerwick, and North Berwick. Each of these fell into a different category, so giving us the opportunity to compare the different attributes and look at what drove demand differently in different locations. So the first step was essentially to try and define the town centre. The improvement services have a town centre geography. However, this obviously doesn't overlay perfectly with other data sets, so data zones and postcodes. So first of all, we had to create the town centres. From this, we could then build the attributes of the different town centres specifically. So population size, household size, and then certain indicators started emerging. So for example, as we've touched on, places like North Berwick or Forres, have older populations. Places like Stonehaven, Lerwick have much higher dwelling in the town centre, potentially due to the sort of historic nature. We then started drilling into more specific drivers that would impact sort of housing demand, housing affordability. So in this case, we're looking at earnings. The key thing here potentially is not just the average earnings within a town centre, which you'll see again, North Berwick, Stonehaven, far higher, but it's also the spread of earnings. So in the chart to the bottom left, you can see places like North Berwick and Stonehaven have a far wider range of average earnings of people living in the town centre, whereas you go to Lerwick and Galashiels, and whilst the average is lower, it's also very narrow, which doesn't necessarily provide sort of graduated economy or graduated housing affordability within the town centre, which we'll touch on slightly later. Looking at sales values, obviously this represents demand and economic affordability, quite a broad spread. A lot of town centres are very affordable. So you can see the cluster there, likes of Galashiels and so on, where prices are under 100K on average and under £100 per square foot in many cases. You contrast this with high demand locations like North Berwick, where average house price is now 300K and average pounds per square foot is well over £300 a square foot. So some of the contrasts in the housing markets within these town centres are quite stark. Something that was pretty consistent was there's often limited supply within the town centres. So the number of transactions, the number of properties coming to the market were quite constrained. This obviously has an impact on allowing people to move in or move within the market. Notably, some of the more successful town centres, they have a bit more of a diversified housing stock. So you can get smaller terraced units, and it isn't just quite such a focused product or property band. This is also seen in the rental market, where again, very limited supply often, and a very sort of strong concentration in 1 and 2 bedroom apartments. Notably looking at churn levels within the market, so the number of properties relative to the stock that are coming onto the market. A lot of these town centres had a very low level of market churn, so 1 to 3%. And if you consider, say, dynamic urban centres would typically be 10 to 20% of the stock coming back onto the market, you can see that actually the opportunities to move into the area or move property within the private rental sector are quite constrained. Looking at the stock itself, there were some notable differences in different town centres. If you take the likes of Airdrie and Galashiels, pretty much all the property stock there is in A to D council tax bands. This contrasts high demand markets such as North Berwick, Stonehaven, where over a quarter of the stock is in E to H. And again, that differential allows for a graduated housing market serving sort of wider range of demand. We also looked at the sort of average size of the stock within these town centres using EPC data. Again, notably, if you take the likes of Airdrie, the average size, 66 square meters, was amongst the smallest, but also the range of properties in that data was quite narrow. So you were between 33 and 150 square meters. By contrast, if you start looking at some of the other markets, you've got a far broader range of size of units available, even if they are within the same sort of property type. Looking at another element of town centre housing is the age of the stock. So again, some pretty stark contrasts between some of the areas, some of the town centres we looked at. Looking at Airdrie, a lot of the majority of the stock there is dated between the 1950s and 1990s. This contrasts, quite highly with the likes of Stonehaven, where you've got high quality historic stock from pre-1919, or from Fort William, where there's actually been quite a lot of development in the 2000s onwards. So again, that sort of shows that there are quite big differences in the sort of built environment when we were comparing these different town centers, and that will impact obviously the demand. So from this, a few of the indicators that allowed us to kind of sort of have a look at demand. So vacancy rates in properties, the percent vacant and long-term empty on council tax registers, low at Galashiels, quite high. By contrast, North Berwick has one of the highest levels of second home ownership in Scotland, again indicating very, very strong levels of demand against lower levels of demand. So we also looked at the commercial space within the town centres as a driver of demand for locating. So on the left, we've got office use versus retail as a percentage of the valuation roll. So some interesting points there is obviously you've got the likes of Airdrie, Low at Galashiels. These operate as commerce centres within their regions. So they're actually quite high levels of office use compared to some of the other town centres. So there's a key driver of why people are coming into the town centre. By contrast, the likes of Fort William or North Berwick, these are tourism and lifestyle locations. So they've got high levels of hotel, guest house, food and beverage offering, nightlife. So quite contrasting in many ways, but it's also quite interesting when you look at the likes of, say, Airdrie and North Berwick, which both have a similar percentage of food and beverage / nightlife offering, but the way it's delivered is quite different. So taking a breakdown, in Airdrie, a third of the food and beverage offering / nightlife is takeaway. By contrast, if you look at the likes of North Berwick, you've got cafes, you've got restaurants, you've got far lower level of takeaway. So whilst the percentages are the same, there's a contrast between a functional food and beverage operation servicing office and nighttime economy versus a lifestyle offering. So again, impacting the demand as a place to live and reside. So just to kind of move towards the end, these are, again, emerging findings and yet to be finalized. So one of the key things that we found was obviously there was a limited residential activity in a lot of these markets. So a lack of depth, a lack of choice. And obviously this has a sort of limiting factor for in-migration or residency within the town centre itself. Many of the towns are therefore not really established as residential destinations. And their economic base relies on sort of like an office or a retail offering, and people traveling in for work or recreation rather than the resident population. Obviously, this is a challenge if a town centre, as we've touched on, is lose the importance of retail or changes in working patterns, how that can support the retail and recreation economy. In terms of housing supply, quality and aspiration, the residential stock in a lot of these town centres lack quality, and they don't really offer a lifestyle or aspirational value for people to relocate there. They're relatively affordable with low average sales values and rents, but these low values reflect a lack of quality stock often and limited demand. And often the town centre will actually be competing with higher quality, larger modern stock, just a short distance. Unless you're offering a lifestyle, then people can still access the town centre without living there. The challenge, therefore, with an affordably driven local market is that there is also likely to be constrained spending power. And the successful town centres that we saw have a tier of wealth or a graduated economy, whether that's spending power from residents or visitors, but that allows a successful sort of business economy. And it also allows sort of graduated housing market. Pull factors driving housing demand. Often the successful town centres from these case studies, had a blend of pull factors, whether it was employment and amenity or lifestyle or tourism. If you take the North Berwicks and Stonehaven examples, they're coastal, they've got high quality stock, they're accessible strong retail and recreation offerings, and these make them a desirable place to live. And it's this diversification often of uses that can drive the sort of demand in these locations. And then we see higher average prices, lower vacancies, higher owner occupation rates, and higher rates of second home ownership as indicators of that demand. Obviously, towns are located in a wide variety of locations and can fulfill different functions, and that can shape how these town centres work. Obviously, in the northeast, southeast, the location near to vibrant economic cities, of influential factors. Towns such as Lerwick and Fort William act as regional economic centres, so therefore more of a mix of commercial functions. However, as we touched on earlier, a lot of these functions have been superseded by edge of town retail or edge of town business parks, and that is leaving a void. So many of the town centres are also local economic hubs for civic functions. And one of the opportunities, I guess, here is, council ownership in locations or repurposing of buildings does lead to an opportunity for redevelopment. So looking ahead, obviously, pandemic has sped up a lot of the changes. Residential use is being adopted as a key method to underpin a lot of economic economic base of a lot of locations. So that's not just town centres, but it's the concept of 20-minute neighbourhoods. Town centres are often competing with other neighbourhoods in the same town. So there has to be a compelling value proposition. And there is this potential for higher levels of town centre living, through brownfield first strategies or 20-minute neighbourhoods to sort of elevate these locations. And the residential market has a lot of potential to underpin this growth. So I think that's where we've got to, and I think I've slightly run over my allocated time. But happy to field questions either now or at any other point offline.
Brilliant. Thank you so much for that, Andrew. That's a lot of information in that report. I am going to move on, but can I just ask one quick question? Just regarding this report, what was the timescale of it? Because I know that you mentioned that the office use in town centres. So was a post-pandemic home from working put into the factoring of this report, or was this pre-pandemic? I just wanted to know.
No, a lot of the data sets are pre-pandemic.
Okay.
Yep, and with the office use, it's the latest valuation roll, so that's from a few years ago, I think.
Okay, that's interesting. Thanks very much. We will come back to you and ask for questions, but I'll move on to the next agenda item. And can I please introduce Ken Ford from Beyond Retail Property Fund from Paisley Shopping Centre.
Yes, thank you very much. I seem to have lost my slides. Caroline, can you help? Or Alison, sorry.
Is it easier if I just share them for you?
I think it probably is.
Okay, bear with me one moment.
I seem to have other things on. Anyway, thank you very much, convener, and thank you all, and good afternoon. Thank you for the opportunity to canter through in under 10 minutes our ideas and ambitions for Paisley. First of all, if I may, a couple of words about Beyond Retail, which is not just a seminar title, but it's actually a way of life for some of us. It's a private business. It seeks to invest in challenged high street retail properties throughout the UK. We are a demand-led business, so we seek to satisfy occupational demand in multi-format residential, hotels, high street health, co-working, and matching that demand to the supply, ever-increasing supply of redundant retail property, and to deliver on regeneration agendas. And Paisley is very definitely a case in point. Next slide, please. So why Paisley? Notwithstanding the fact that I'm a 1970s graduate of Paisley Tech/University, but Paisley itself has very strong fundamentals. As we all know, Scotland's largest town, 76,000 population, a historic town, more listed buildings anywhere other than Edinburgh, so it's a big environment. The transport links are great, fourth best rail station in the UK, in Scotland, although you'd never know it with the lack of investment, I have to say. Adjacency to the airport, but critically, a passionate and engaged community. There's a real Paisley identity, which is very evident in everything that we do there. and also crucially a motivated council and stakeholder group, as evidenced by the fact that they promoted, as you know, the vision document for Paisley, which they published in 2019, which had at its heart really a regeneration template. But the other thing about Paisley, of course, was the mechanics of the opportunity in many ways. I mean, people like ourselves are clearly always on the lookout for opportunities. And in Paisley, we had a motivated vendor. Believe it or not, it was a Los Angeles-based debt fund who had bought a portfolio of non-performing loans, which included this site as security. The borrower was in default, so you had a conscripted owner, which actually meant that we were able to transact and acquire the property at a price that made sense for us in terms of our overall ambitions for the scheme. Next slide, please. So the centre itself is 30 years old this year, actually built in 1992. The existing scheme is over 200,000 square feet, together with a remote, although adjacent actually, multi-storey car park, 500 odd spaces. It has 40 retail units and a former co-op department store. If you look at the slide here, the units are shown in basically 4 and 2. The department store is number 3. And in addition to acquiring the scheme, we've also acquired the adjacent Marks and Spencer, which is shown as number 1 on the slide. Now the scheme continues to trade. Albeit I think it's about 70% let, I would have thought. There are flexible terms, which enables us to achieve the vacant possession that will be necessary for us to be able to deliver on our plans. The co-op store, which is vacant now, we have we've done an arrangement here with Outspoken Arts, who are fully occupying the property for a variety of community purposes, ranging from exhibitions, workshops, and indeed the top floor is going to be the Panto venue at Christmas time. So I'm looking upon this really as an income-producing development site, which makes the economics of the enterprise a little more affordable. But as I said before, we're an occupational-led and demand-led business. So our pre-purchase research identified demand for a hotel, a demand, well, we thought there was demand for town centre residential. And historically, there's been a suggestion of a town centre requirement for a health and wellbeing centre within the town centre. So our own master planning respected the spirit of the council's vision, as I mentioned earlier in the 2019 document, but more focused on occupational deliveries and also sustainable development. The vision envisaged, I think, wholesale demolition and clearance of the site. Our plans retain certainly the principal buildings, certainly shown in the plan here, number 2, which is will be repurposed for the hotel. Number 3, the large format former co-op building. The units themselves will be demolished, but we will retain the structure of the existing scheme. And that sustainability factor, I think, is very important, and from our point of view, represents excellent business as well. New slide, please. So in March this year, I'm pleased that we were able to achieve planning consent for our master plan, which followed extensive consultation with all the stakeholders, both statutory and community, and actually establishes the development framework that we're wishing to move forward. The next slide, I think, shows the mixture of uses. So we can actually see there that we have the hotel shown in purple. From the high street down, you can see the residential formats, and then at the Causey Side Street end, which is to the right of the slide, you see the large format building, which is hopefully could be encouraged. The health authorities could be encouraged to look at that for the health and well-being in town centre location, but also education and employment uses as well. Now, all of this, of course, is framed within a substantial public realm investment, which creates a new public square. As you can see, there's around the Paisley Arts Centre. It also reintroduces, in fact, a lot of the historic street pattern from the High Street through to New Street and down to Causey Street as well. In terms of where we are with delivering following the master plan application and consent, that we are in advanced and final stages of negotiation with an international hotel operator who will operate the 129-bed hotel on New Street, shown purple. The Resi challenge, already referred to, is interesting. I'm certainly learning a lot about RSLs and ships, which is fascinating. But I think it is actually it is a challenge. The viability of town centre development for residential purposes, I think, is evident. And then we've got again, we're looking at the large format department store, multiple uses there I mentioned earlier. Ideally, we can encourage the health authorities. If not, then education and commercial certainly will, I think, come forward in response to the overall improvement in the town centre. Public realm is important, and I say that the framing the arts centre, I think, is important as well. So that's what we're doing. That is within hopefully the 10 minutes. I think in conclusion, I think if next slide, I think just to go back to the master plan image, we've made real progress here in the 18 months since our initial investment. We've got gratifying occupational support from the hotel. We are hopeful we can actually identify a residential partner to work with us on in delivering some 80 flats that's shown there on the High Street. We continue to try to engage with the health authorities, the educational authorities, university and the college, very supportive of what we're trying to do. But I think the real success here, I think, in many ways, is the partnership, the excellent relationship with the council and the community and other stakeholders. Everyone is behind this. It is a cross-party, cross-political encouragement and support for it, which is that the officers are fully engaged and highly motivated to deliver on this. And we are there with our expertise, such as it is, our money and our energy to deliver. And hopefully we're looking forward to the next 12 months, where I think that we would expect to be in for planning and detailed planning for the hotel, hopefully for the residential, and then perhaps even this time next year, towards the end of 2023, we could be on site for delivering the project. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ken. That's really fascinating and very exciting for Paisley. So I wish you all the best with that. I think it's an important point that you bring up, is that you've got cross-party support, because I think that's one of a frustration to me as a councillor previously in an MSP as we move forward with long-term strategies for town centres. I think you need to get cross-party support, whether people are in administration or in opposition, because it's more than a 5-year plan. So that's really, really important. If I could ask you, Ken, just as I'll start off the discussion, then I'll move on to my MSP colleagues. It's clear that there's currently quite a bit of challenges in attracting private sector for residential investment into town centres. So what key fiscal or policy levers would make town centre living more deliverable?
Well, it's all about viability, I think. Even if I was to donate the site to a residential partner, then I believe it is challenging. It's to do with clearly the capital value of the end product, but the construction costs, clearly are a challenge as well. But I think town centre living is at the heart of a lot of these initiatives. Getting people back living in town centres as they did do 50 years ago. We're in this 50-year cycle where, back in the 70s, everybody wanted a shopping centre, and Paisley's got 2 of them, covered shopping centres. Everyone went to America, come back, and then built these backland and contrived retail properties. And clearly the structural changes now in how people spend their time and money is very evident, has been exacerbated by the pandemic, as we all know. But getting people back into multi-purpose, multi-use, living, working, leisure venues, basically, that the town centre should become, is really what it's about. But the viability, we're lucky, as I say, we had a motivated vendor. We were able to acquire this at a price, a realistic price, and he wasn't necessarily, I think he was more motivated to disinvest from Paisley than we are to invest. So we were very keen to do that, and I think I think that was a fortunate opportunity. Rebasing of values for a lot of town centre properties is a prerequisite to be able to bring forward these sort of initiatives generally.
Great, thank you, Ken. I'm going to ask if any of my MSP colleagues would like to come in here to the discussion or ask any questions. I don't know if you could raise your hand, and Alison can alert me who would like to comment. I know Marie McNair has had to leave, unfortunately. While we wait, in case someone wants to come in, I will take a question from David Main for Ken. How do you ensure a measure of equity between competing town centres, and what criteria ought to be employed?
How do you
ensure a measure of equity between competing town centres, and what criteria ought to be employed?
Mm-hmm. Well, I don't think that's necessarily my responsibility. I'm a great believer in local democracy. I'm a great believer in the power of the councils. I think I'm a great believer in Marshall plans, if you like. Not necessarily. And clearly our approach is a master plan approach, which actually is good for Paisley. Now. Paisley is a very interesting thing, because you look at competing, clearly the town centre of Paisley has been severely denuded by planning consents given in the immediate vicinity of Paisley. I mean, M&S, departed the high street, which is clearly an opportunity for us to move, the road into a free parking retail warehouse. And even more than that, of course, the behemoth that is Braehead clearly has an influence on the town centre as well. And that's even before you get to Linwood and everything else. So I think it's more about, I think, from my point of view, I will do the best I can for myself, my investors, and for Paisley. And I think these are aligned interests as far as I'm concerned. But I don't think I have any, unless I was looking to develop an adjacent town centre, then I probably have to have a more balanced view.
Brilliant. Thank you, Ken. If I can bring in Neil Bibby, MSP, please.
Thanks, Kevin. It wasn't a question. I've met Ken recently and had the opportunity to ask him lots of questions. I just wanted to make a comment just to commend Ken for his presentation and the excellent work that he's doing. And also I see Gary Kerr from Paisley Community Trust is on the call as well, and commend Gary and Paisley Community Trust for all the work that is going on in Paisley to develop the town centre.
Thank you, Neil. Much appreciated.
Thank you. I'll just move on. We do have a few more minutes, so I will ask another question. Given the climate issue, and I'll open it up to any of our guests to answer this, does the Housing to 2040 policy focus enough on incentivising town centre housing? Don't know if someone wants to raise a hand, someone other than Ken, because he's getting all the questions. I can't see anyone else, and I can only see a few people.
I think Mary's just coming in.
Mary, would you like to come in?
I think the policy environment and the policy context is all there. Everything is in place from the policy point of view. I think it's back to the point of how we deliver appropriate levels of housing, of town centre living for each of the individual places that we have. The wellbeing agenda, I think, will play a critical role, and what we are interested in doing through the work that we're doing just now through the Short Life Working Group is understanding. So back to that point about, the financial viability of developments, we are effectively only taking a very short-term view of financial viability and of the individual viability of project proposals. We are not fully taking account of all of these wider benefits that town centre living will bring to the place. In terms of the whole health and wellbeing agenda, there's a whole long-term cost saving opportunity associated with town centre living that we are taking absolutely no account of in terms of the financial viability and appraisal point of view. And I think we need to get a better balance and a better understanding of what all of the full range of benefits that we can achieve from town centre living activity.
Mm. Well, I'm very keen to establish a health and wellbeing centre in central Paisley.
Thank you. And maybe if I could just ask the two of you also, will the NPF for the National Planning Framework help encourage town centre living in your view?
It certainly won't discourage, but whether it will actively encourage, I think we're back to the point about carrots and sticks. Mm-hmm. How do we get a good balance between the things that will encourage the activities that we want to see and stop those activities that we think are having perhaps more financially viable and attractive in the short term, but will deliver some of the long-term constraints that we know that we'll have to. So I think from that wellbeing point of view and from the wellbeing agenda is the stuff around failure demand. We are effectively investing in things just now that will create problems for us in the future. And that's the point I had at the very start of my presentation around what are the things that we're doing just now that in 10, 15, 20 years time we'll look back on and regret having spent so much time and effort on, or we'll regret not having done.
Okay, I'm going to just bring you, because we only got a couple of minutes left, but Peter Coyne, would you like to come in?
Yeah, thanks. My question to Ken relates to the de-risking of the residential units. If I understood what you're doing there is selling them to a social landlord rather than bringing them to the market as a speculative residential development. And I'm wondering whether that's almost an inevitability in these kinds of developments, where there is very little evidence, market evidence, as Retty was saying, in some of the lower value town centres. And yet it is not inconceivable that with the high quality environment that is being generated in Ken's scheme and in other schemes, that those values could in fact be realised, but that the market isn't ready yet to take the risks. Is that a fair comment?
It is absolutely right, Peter. I've had innumerable conversations with private residential developers who are all generally excited at the prospect. They like the scheme and everything else, but then they're not pioneers. They are not pioneers. They won't put their money behind their excitement, and because again, these are in the main rear view assessments and appraisals they make on the current position. And then when they actually then have to forecast what they need to do to get a return on their return on their investment, then they do find that challenging. Which is why we were encouraged by Phil and others to look at the social sector, and even they, I think, at times get a little stressed about this. So it's, I think, it is a challenge, but it is a fundamental element of all of these sort of proposals to have people back living in your town centres. Yeah. Fundamental.
Very good. Yeah, I think de-risking is a key thing for the public sector for these town centre developments to succeed in the future.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Thank you very much. We are now on 1:45, so we have run out of time. Can I say a huge big thank you to everybody that's participated today, especially our guests. You've given us a lot of information to think about. And I was wondering, Alison, if we could maybe forward any slideshows or any links that were put in the chat today to everybody that's attended. That would be great, because I know there's been a huge amount of interest in it. Just another bit of current business is the Economy Committee is currently doing an inquiry into town centres, and it is quite fascinating. You can catch up on the Scottish Parliament TV if anybody's interested in catching up with all the work that they've been doing. And the next meeting is on Wednesday, the 7th of September at 1:45 to 1:45. So with that, I'd like to say thank you to everybody and see you next time. Thank you.
Well.